Good morning, and thank you for joining us for our 12:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time session entitled Messaging for Education, Justice, and Transformation. I will turn it over to Scott Nine and Sean Strader.
All right. Hi, everybody. We hopefully will very shortly be joined, Sean and I, by Beth Glenn, who's the former communication director for the NAACP and is involved in some national communications strategy work. I'm excited to have her join us as long as we can get some technical challenges. I hope she'll pop on any minute, but we'll go ahead and get started. As we do that. I'm going to share my screen, and then hopefully that will allow for, let's see, we're hitting that button, share here, messaging, and present. Now, can everybody hear me still?
Yes, I can.
And can you see this nice and big on your screen?
I can.
Well, excellent. You're the only person. You're the only.
I see it. I see it within your Google Hangout frame.
I can see it too.
Yeah.
But when other people talk, I don't see it. So if
yeah, you have to click on my picture so it will stay up constant.
Okay.
That's how the other one was with Dana too.
Okay.
Okay, great. So we're talking messaging for education, justice, and transformation. And the goal of this time is really to give a kind of survey tour of some of the work that we're aware of that's going on across the country in some different networks, and to provide some tools for folks to dive deeper on those things. It won't in any way capture all the detail or nuance, but will hopefully give people a way to see where they might want to dive deeper, and also pull out some threads of what we might want to be thinking about and how it might inform both our own kind of personal messaging efforts as well as ideas as a network and organization. The learning that we'll share is going to come from kind of 6 primary efforts. There are a lot of different things going on around messaging, and I think that's really a good thing. But we'll focus on these 6 to get started. The first one to share about is the Frameworks Institute's Core Story project, and to give some background on that, it's been a few years now since IDEA first learned about this effort from Frameworks. What happened is a series of foundations. The Frameworks Institute does kind of message framing research on a variety of public issues, not just education. And they were funded to investigate how the public conceives of educational issues, and the lens of these funders were really in trying to advance a kind of progressive education justice kind of messaging, student-centered learning, and they wanted to think about how people currently conceive and think about education, and how new narratives might be shaped in ways that might be the most accessible. For folks familiar with some of the work in the kind of immigration movement, this is a similar kind of pre-step that happened there as folks begin to try to find what are actually effective messages for folks. So the assumption behind this project is that current efforts aren't successful because we often don't frame in ways that people understand educational issues, and in Frameworks, work is built off of not just George Lakoff, but work like that from kind of cognitive linguistic scientists. If folks aren't familiar with George Lakoff, there's a quick read you can read called Don't Think of an Elephant, which is alive in kind of political circles in particular, but is really about this idea of how do we make sense of things. The link takes you to this Core Story project, which now has several different reports and iterations that have influenced significantly how IDEA has written some of our own documents, and is very alive in work happening in Vermont and in many other networks, and you'll see them kind of woven through some of these other efforts that we're going to talk about. Sean, you want to add anything on Frameworks?
Well, I mean, I think you're right to say that Frameworks is heavily influenced idea, it's definitely one of the most powerful tools that I see or that I'm aware of. And even in my personal work, I've referenced framework and pointed people towards it just because of how provocative and how framing, right? It's framed the way I frame things, so it's literally framed the way I'm thinking about the world and engagement, and has had a considerable impact on how I speak with peers or colleagues or family members or whoever about educational change, recognizing that different frames work for different purposes. Aside from that, I just wanted to welcome Beth. Beth has joined. I don't know if you're still in the Hangout, but hi, Beth.
Hi.
Hey, Beth, welcome. Glad you could make it.
Hi, thanks everyone.
Yeah, Beth, I don't know how familiar you are with Google Hangouts, but what I've done is so that people, because it's open air recording, I've shared my screen. So if you click on me on the bottom, it will pop the PowerPoint that you're familiar with into view. And we've just done an introduction. I introduced you briefly, although now you're here for people to see. So if you want to say a little more of an introduction about yourself. And then I've just introduced frameworks, and would be excited for you to share any thoughts you have about the Frameworks Core Story project before we move on. So welcome. Why don't you do just kind of a quick intro and share about frameworks?
Great, thanks Scott. Can everybody hear me? Because I got a little message. This is my first Google Hangout, so bear with me.
Can hear you great. Can hear you great.
Okay, fantastic. My name is Beth Glenn, and I'm an education policy and advocacy strategy consultant. And I'm coming most recently from the National NAACP. I served as their education director. And I got engaged with the work around frameworks through a group called TASSSC that you'll hear a little bit more about later on in the presentation. But a lot of the funders who are fueling some of this progressive work that Scott was talking about, engage frameworks to try and talk about a way that we could move public opinion more in line so that it would be more receptive to progressive education messages and messages that made people want to start thinking in ways that made them open to more progressive education transformation solutions and that would support the kind of issues we wanted. So we found it really helpful. The people who have come together around TASSSC, we're trying to basically coalesce a lot of parallel efforts. IDEA is part of it. The Learning First Alliance is part of it. The Alliance to Reclaim Our Schools is part of it. There are lots of people who are doing really fantastic work, including many folks who are probably going to join this call, who have been talking in similar ways, but not in a sort of planned direction together. And so Frameworks has helped us by doing some of the polling and focus group testing that that small organizations and even large organizations like the NAACP, don't have the funding to do. And so it's been helpful to help us sort of test the things that sound good to advocates and sound good to people who are expert in terms of how education change should take place, and help us try and communicate these ideas to people who this might be their first time thinking about how to improve in schools and improve teaching and learning, in the last 5 years or in the last 3 years, and they certainly don't spend every day thinking about it like advocates do. So that's been my experience with the Frameworks Core Story work, and excited to join the Hangout.
That's great. Thanks, Beth. So a couple of extra pieces, and then we'll go on to the next one. I think it's often become important to me with frameworks to name where folks might have dissonance with it, and in how you might work with that or think about it. Not that make up your own mind about it, but the way I deal with that is sometimes when I read frameworks work, two things jump out at me besides the kind of getting the kind of understanding and some of the framing, which I find really helpful, it can feel a little decontextualized to me, like it can live as a kind of ahistorical study, and it can live without kind of thinking about regional differences or local differences or cultural differences, and I think that the frameworks folks at this point, I would say that it's not that they don't care about those things or they're not informed by them, but that they're trying to come up and share messages that work well in a fairly practical, kind of real-time basis with kind of folks, and their focus groups are fairly diverse and representative, although again with some limitation. There's not unlimited resources to focus group everywhere around the country. So I share that not because I want to tear it down, but I think it's helpful to know where there might be edges as we kind of try to stitch together these different efforts. Certainly a certain important project that at least in terms of idea and efforts like TASSSC, we're paying a lot of attention to. The last thing to say here is in what's next, I think that frameworks and folks connected to frameworks are working on a lot of kind of toolkit or kind of practical things that can help folks on the ground more. And one of the more specific efforts about that's happening in Vermont, and actually some idea partners and relationships, Helen Beatty at Up for Learning and Daniel Barron, are involved in working with the state rollout of Act 77, this law in Vermont that every young person have a personalized learning plan by 2017, and they're very heavily working with frameworks understanding as they do their kind of public series of campaigns across Vermont that are going to start happening this fall. We'll move to the next one. This is the Learnings from North Dakota Study Group 2014. And a number of folks who are on the live part of this call have had a chance to be a part of NDSG in some way. But I wanted to lift up this last February's gathering in Detroit, in which the study of the NDSG was around this equation, fight plus build equals transformation. And the reason for that is the way in which the title even of this session, Messaging for Justice and Transformation, and some work at the Spirit in Action Gathering, which we'll talk about in a minute, is a theme, this idea of trying to link efforts to defend and efforts to transform. And this was a place of real study around that, not coming to a final conclusion. What's provided is a link to the NDSG reader and the site where there are some notes and some video and some pictures of that. And I thought important to kind of lift up that examination as an open question and how those things link together and point them to that, as well as the upcoming NDSG conference that's going to be happening in South Texas. Sean, you were at this NDSG. Crystal, you also were there and are on the planning committee for 2015. Anything you want to kind of elevate or share or that jumps out at you as kind of key learnings from that experience?
For me, I think, you know, some of the in the hallway conversations, especially, and also some of the more promoted sessions around just like this fight plus build equals transformation question mark, really kind of highlighted so much kind of difference depending on where communities are located, communities of people, what they're struggling with, what their issues are, how they're approaching them. With the fight being a very contentious term on whether or not to include in the equation, right? Very illuminating, I think, to be in a room full of people from a lot of different backgrounds, especially in Detroit, and also personally for me, having moved to Puerto Rico about 1.5 years ago and coming to understand, you know, the historical oppression and even current oppression of Puerto Rico. The term fight really resonated for me in some ways, and then listening to others, the term fight was rather problematic. And so to kind of sum it up there is probably one of the most powerful things that I took away of, you know, even looking at a study of how to link defense of public education, like it in line with probably the Frameworks Institute and what I've taken away from learning about what they're up to in framing things in a provocative and accessible way. Those terms are pretty interesting to look at with a broad community of people from diverse backgrounds.
Thanks, Sean. Crystal, you want to add anything?
Yeah, sure. I agree with pretty much everything that Sean said. A lot of us we took most of the cadre of organizers with us to NDSU 2013, which was a lot of our first experiences with that, going to that gathering, and just to see how NDSG continues to build on the work that they're fighting and to build and transform was exciting. And also, I actually at the end of July, I got to participate in the planning committee for 2015, where the focus is more on bilingualism and the Black, Brown, and white communities. So it's good to see how this group continues to fight and build together to transform. And it's good that they actually are embracing the challenges that are coming with all of that, with all of us trying to move to improve education for our children and community. So it's been an awesome experience over the past 2.5 years for me, and I'm excited about what's to come.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the last thing I'll share is that I think what's interesting about NDSG in its 40 years and I think a state of real interesting evolution at the moment is it's not an organization. It's all kind of volunteer run, and it really is a place of study. They're not necessarily an actor in and of themselves, although they do some action-oriented things. The folks like Greg Smith and David Sobel doing work on place-based education and how they've linked with Grace Lee Boggs and how that works to the building of the Boggs Community School and how that links to a place like Mission Hill. And you have folks who have long histories as educators and as teacher preparation professionals and researchers mixing with community organizers, parents, and activists in a space that's becoming, I think, more complex, more culturally, racially, not even diverse, but deep. Certainly Dr. Vincent Harding, before he passed away, being at NDSG 2013, offered a real deep provocation, and it's just a real interesting space. And if folks aren't familiar with it, it's a place that I think offers a real interesting touchstone of kind of intersections that might be off folks' radar. So sharing that, and let's move on to the next.
I was just going to add one more thing, Scott.
Yeah.
One of the other things that I'm excited about in regards to NDSG is the increased involvement of younger folks.
Yeah.
At this planning meeting, we actually had a few more folks that were under 35, which was good because you have, the elders are seasoned, and then you have the younger folks that actually do a lot of more hands-on work with youth. And what I also did was share next year's theme, and I speak Spanglish, not Spanish, so I wasn't sure if you wanted to pronounce it, Sean, or Scott. I don't want to chop it up. Historias de Educación.
Yeah, sorry, I had to look to find it. Historias de Educación, and then in English. So
Nice.
Histories of Education.
Pedagogy, language, and social change. So.
Beautiful. All right, let's move to the next one. So, and Beth, I'm hoping that you can dive in here as well. Beth attended this with me and many other folks. So folks may remember Spirit in Action. We've, idea organizer-wise, have had several intersections there. Madawaskar, Klublal, Jaisha, Duta, a number of different folks have been involved in Spirit in Action's work. And they put together a specific listening project where they did some videotaping of folks at the Free Minds, Free People conference, summer 2013, and then at IDEC 2013 in Colorado. And they took those video recordings of folks who are doing kind of education justice advocacy work, and they tried to kind of mine them for kind of trends. And they tried to incorporate or run a balance about what were the kind of recommendations of frameworks, and then how do these folks who are doing that activism, what are they seeing needs to happen, and what are the messages they're using. And then they organized this gathering where Free Minds, Free People, Tara Mack in particular, myself from IDEA, and other people were used as a kind of sounding board or advisory group to gather these different educators, organizers, and influencers to have a conversation about what are effective communication strategies, what can be learned, and how might they stitch together. The slide tells you some of the groups that were present, but Beth, I wonder if you would say a little bit about what did you see as the assumptions behind that event, and then what are your kind of key takeaways that you would lift out of that experience?
Sure. So, one of the things that came up or came through, pretty clearly was definitely the fact that, again, people had been doing a lot of thinking about the same issues, but in their own little silos, right, and in their own parallel tracks together. And so it was certainly helpful and illuminating to hear, oh, there's another pocket of work that's similar, that's over in another corner that I didn't necessarily know about, and to make those connections. One of the things that was really exciting to come out of the listening project itself was to hear the excerpts from the activists that they interviewed that they felt like represented thematic repetitions, right? So things that came up again and again, they picked a representative sort of quote and a person to attach that to. And, I think that's the really strong beginnings of what could be a sort of public campaign and a set of public messages that we could attach to the education transformation movement. One thing that did stick out is that none of the advocates and organizers, or very few of the advocates and organizers that they talked to and highlighted as representative, were really using the themes from frameworks. So, that stood out to me as a potential site for inquiry. Was it because they hadn't been exposed, they didn't find it relevant, they didn't, and I'd like to do some sort of probing and find out, why that is and where we can go from there. And if we can use some of their insights and language to try and marry, what is coming from the very formal cognitive linguistic process, what that recommends that we ought to say, as compared to what social justice advocates who spend their days talking to parents, talking to community members who are concerned about education. So we can marry what's been working for them on the ground with what some of these sort of formal processes are suggesting to us. So that's the part that I found really interesting and generative about the Spirit in Action gathering.
That's awesome. Thank you. If folks are interested to kind of take Beth's provocation and dig in for your own assessment, if you click the link here, will take you to the site. Spirit in Action has the trends they found in these videos, but you can also get at the videos, which are really nice. They're like high quality videos shot by Manavaskar Klublau, who's quite a talented filmmaker. And can be used in a lot of different ways, right? At the gathering, one thing they did was to show videos and then have the group kind of respond and react to what they heard from different folks and what resonated for them. And so, Beth, I'm with you in thinking they provide a really interesting kind of another different point of touchstone to dig into, and I join you in your inquiry. I think it's important. What's next for the Spirit in Action Listening Project is not totally clear. There's a listserv connected of the groups who were present, but the bigger goals of that project are really trying to surface out of the group what people share in common and what is actually helpful. And because there are so many moving parts and efforts, and we'll share more about some of the other ones, I think that this is a loose group of connections with stronger relationships, but isn't necessarily trying to be a something yet. It's about making connections, and I think it's not yet clear what exactly is going to come next. But something certainly to be paying attention to and follow into if you're interested in this kind of effort. So we'll move on to integrity in education. Sabrina Stevens was on with us yesterday for a bit, and I just wanted to share something that might be a little hidden out of view from folks, but I think is real important. One of the things that in her work with integrity in education, and if folks aren't familiar with that, you can go to the site and there's a nice spot where you can kind of watch Sabrina doing some pretty powerful messaging work, particularly on MSNBC, but as a kind of messenger in the news. Sabrina was also a part of this prior gathering with Spirit in Action. But this underlying idea that people on the ground could use some scaffolding or fun reminders about how to get their message across. And if you click on the example that's linked, you'll see a screenshot of an email. She's put together a newsletter that's about speaking about education, where she's giving tips to folks. And that's not actually currently an open thing. You have to send a note to Integrity and ask to get on that newsletter. But I encourage folks to get into that Speaking of Education newsletter. And so if you're interested, you would just send a quick note to Integrity and Education and say, please add me to that. I've heard about it, and get joined. Or you can email me after the session, and I can send you something. There's a little link inside of the message that will let you join. And she's trying to kind of organically get that shared amongst advocates who have some alignment around these messages. And I think it's important only because there's I think her experience as working inside of unions as a teacher and really studying these framing works, she's got a very strong example of not accepting the framing we're given. And I think is giving some really practical, fun ways to respond. And it's just a nice resource for folks to be aware of and know about. Does anybody want to add anything to that? All right, next one. So TASSSC, the Alliance for Smart Schools, Systems, and Communities. To give just a quick history of it for folks who aren't familiar with it, and it's not like a public-facing effort at this point. This is a gathering that's roots come from Warren Simmons, who is I think his president is the title that he has at the Annenberg Institute for School Reform, was a part of the Presidential Transition Committee experience in 2008 when Linda Darling-Hammond and Pedro Noguera and others were working with President Obama's transition team. For folks not familiar with that, when presidential transitions happen, often folks who may become secretaries or get inside of administrations lead a process of helping prepare a transition into those roles. Folks, may be aware that Linda Darling-Hammond didn't end up in that role, and Secretary Duncan instead took that position. But Warren Simmons had this experience of watching as the election turned into administration, the folks who had the connections to social justice groups and organized groups of people in communities quickly had very little say or power in terms of what the actual direction of education work was going to take place. And he was captured by the idea that some kind of people's transition committee that would have real political influence needed to be put together. That instinct eventually led to Cheryl Petty being hired at Annenberg and some engagement with some foundations to help fund a gathering at the Ford Foundation last July, and the beginnings of a conversation around what would some kind of hubbed effort look like. One of the aspects of that work was to focus on messaging. And Beth has actually been a longer part of that effort than I have, but we've been working collaboratively, everybody on a volunteer basis, in this effort to think about the same dilemma that I think IDEA has been working on, which is how do these different efforts coalesce, what tools can be provided. Beth, I'm hoping you might share a little bit about kind of the why, what's the working assumption behind that, what's some of the things you've seen TASSSC working on that's exciting to share, and then maybe you'd kind of take us through a little bit of the tools that are provided here for folks to take a look at.
Cool. So, yeah, and going back to this idea of us all kind of working diligently in our own corners and saying similar things, but not exactly the same way, perhaps not the most effective way, perhaps we had no intelligence about whether it was the most effective way, not in a way that was geared or could be tailored toward different audiences. So these are the sort of questions that the folks in the messaging hub came together to try and broach. And we sort of engaged in a large crosswalking exercise whereby we took some of the foundational documents and some of the messaging that was coming out of our various constituent groups or groups that we were connected with. And we put them in a big chart, essentially, and said, you know, who's talking about, you know, teacher development? Who is talking about funding for public schools? What are we saying? How are we phrasing it? Are we talking about each child, every child, all children? Are we talking about individualized learning, personalized learning? You know, really to get down to some of the sort of granular questions that arise as soon as you sit down to start thinking about a press release, right, or a statement, or if you get invited to be on a panel at your local community center or speak with parents, etc. You know, what are you run very quickly into these questions that here's what I believe and my organization thinks it believes. How can we get that across in the most effective manner? And we too were able to sort of surface some holes, that there were things that only one or two people were talking about, but they were doing it very powerfully. And that they were getting, oh, I'm looking at the links, and that may be a feature of mine. I'm going to try and see if I can open them. And I don't think I can either. We also, like I said, surfaced some areas that only a couple of people were talking about or that nobody was talking about. And so what we tried to do there is to work together to find some language aligned with the values that we came together around. And those values are very small d democratic. They're about having public input and public engagement and supporting public schooling as a democratic process, as a human process, that, you know, teaching and learning is a profoundly interactive and human engagement heavy enterprise. Let's be humble and let's look at, you know, what the research actually says to inform the work that we try to recommend for schools and the policy change. So those are the values that the initial task steering committee came up with. We use those as a sort of litmus test to invite people into the messaging hub and some other hubs that address different fields of education. And we said, okay, if we all agree on these values, that this is what schooling ought to look like, how could we talk about it in these areas where we're not talking about it as well as we could yet? So that's a bit of a lead-in, and hopefully
that's good. Beth, I wonder, I'll let Sean, who's had a chance to look at these messages, say a little bit about how they've resonated with him, and maybe while doing that, I think when you updated those links, you need to change the permissions to files anyone can view.
Oh, okay.
If you could go into the settings to change the link to say, you won't actually have to change the link, you just have to change the document permissions in Google Docs to say anyone who has it can view, to get them to be shared. Sean, having had a chance to look at the messages coming out of the task group, both the overarching and the issue area messages, would you just say a little bit about, like, how did they land with you? What did you see in them that you might be different or distinguishable?
Sure. I mean, really, looking at both of them, the thing that stood out is just how incredibly provocative and illustrative and, like, tangible. Well, maybe not tangible, how illustrative and provocative the messaging is because of the language used. I mean, it's almost like watching like a fine, it's like reading the work of a fine artist who has wordsmithed these messages together in a way that are just like so digestible. And, you know, my reaction was like visceral, like you know, my body started breathing in a different way, and I'm reading this and I'm like behind it, you know, in a way that isn't always, you know, as we transition from talking about the Frameworks Institute, like the messages we read about progressive education or social justice or human rights, even the most basic human rights, sometimes it just kind of goes in one ear and right out the other or over your head. But the messaging that TASSSC has put forth it's gripping. It's inspiring, and though it's very eloquently written and brilliant, it's not so far detached from I think anybody's mind. What I mean to say is it's accessible. You read it and it's digestible, and I think I think that's probably true for just about anybody who reads it. It definitely, aside from being completely enthused by it, it led me to wonder, like how does more messaging like that spread throughout the work we're all doing? How many people could get behind that? My initial reaction is probably a whole lot. And also, how do we as an organization, how do I as an individual, how do the people we're partnering with learn to message in a way that is so fulfilling and accurate and truth-telling as some of the TASSSC messages have been? That was my reaction. I was astounded. Let's just put it that
way. I think the possibility with the work that's happening there is an attention to the fact that they're suggestions or invitations for other people to grab a hold of and make use of to the extent they find them helpful. And there's a hope that people will respond where they don't resonate, and that the hub being developed there can become a place that is helping listen for and to adjust or course correct and also generate new messages, and that kind of effort is very necessary, and that folks are trying to kind of step forward to do that. Obviously, further infrastructure to be able to do that in a more powerful or more muscular way will require additional resources and not just money, but just people's ability to keep putting their time and energy into that effort. But I think there is a felt sense amongst the group that it's a worthwhile venture, and that more and more folks are being invited into that. So folks can, as soon as we get these links fixed, or after the presentation in the notes and share back, and in the Google site where this video will live, will be links to these documents, and Beth's information and my own are at the end of this presentation, and we just encourage folks to share whether you have as positive a reaction as Sean did, or you have a different reaction, that you share those messages so that they're an active development process. In terms of what's next for TASSSC, there's a meeting of this hub at the end of September being planned. In a sense, the TASSSC, like other efforts, it's not actually an organization, and it is kind of a loose network of folks. It's got some structure. There is a general steering committee for the group as a whole, but at the moment, as a number of different kind of national organizations and funders are all in a good way trying to find each other and strategize together, it's a little fuzzy exactly how all that's going to land, to be really honest and direct about it. And so what, for ideas purposes, we're trying to do is really to be both contributive and to learn from this effort, and to stay tuned and cheer it on and support it in whatever form it finds itself in. Beth, you want to share any closing thoughts, and then we'll go on to the next part of the presentation?
No, I just tried to effect the second change, and sorry for my Luddite tendencies coming up the works here.
No worries. No worries. We'll get it solved. This next slide is something that Beth, you helped put together, and I wonder if you just take people through that a little bit.
Yep. Sean, thank you so much for your feedback. I'm really excited to take that back to the other folks on the messaging hub who've been working on these. And it's a living document, so please, once the links finally work, and I see Dana was able to open it, go put in your comments. There's some that haven't been as refined as others, and that haven't been workshopped as much and wordsmithed smithed as much. And so, you know, if you're bored in the train station, or, you know, feel particularly strongly about a particular issue area or set of the messages and just would like to comment, we definitely welcome that and invite that. And the other thing is, you know, this isn't magic, and so that's part of, I think, some of the value that's coming out of work like the Frameworks Institute is doing. And then that really gave impetus and rise to this first slide. And then the second slide comes from Center for Community Change and Opportunity Agenda, a collaboration that they did about putting community values frame around our messages. So I'll just start with the framework slide. Thanks, Scott. And it's basically, this isn't magic. You know, you can build your own messaging through the same sort of framework and process that we've used to come up with some of the TASS messages. And so what Frameworks recommends is a value, issue, policy, solution process. So they talk about these overarching values, and that's what they really tried to identify first in terms of how do we get the public thinking in ways that are helpful and productive so that they'll be receptive to our messages. And they found that cueing the idea or the meta-narrative around preparing for the future was a helpful frame to use for people. They also found that, you know, invoking the idea that everybody should have opportunity was helpful for people to be receptive to progressive education change messages. And then fairness among places, you know, that everywhere across the USA ought to, you know, feature the same opportunities. And you'll hear this when people talk about how students' life chances shouldn't be determined by their zip code, for instance. And so, you know, this kind of gets into the discourse, and they found that these values and a couple others in different instances will resonate with people. So if you lead with that, then, you know, go more specifically to the issue that you're talking about, and then use what they call, what do they call their metaphors? Simplifying. Help me out, Scott. What do they call their metaphors? Like simplifying strategies or explanations or something like that. But it's essentially a metaphor, right?
Yeah, you got it.
So I've listed 3 here that, you know, they found were resonant. So comparing education transformation to, they say, an orchestra, being a Southern girl from North Carolina, and, you know, talking to community.
We like the big band. I'm with you on the big band.
I refer to a big band or a high school band. You know, that's something that can grasp onto. It's like, okay, there are lots of different sections. Everybody plays their part. Got it. I understand that. They also talk about remodeling a home. So you don't tear down your whole house. You only fix the parts that aren't working, right? And then they talk about what we in the you know, academic and expert circles, you know, call multiple measures. So you shouldn't just use standardized tests to figure out what students know and what they're able to do, but you should also give them projects. And so we say, you know, there should be multiple measures of learning for teachers as well as students. And so the way that they put together a metaphor to talk about that was like a dashboard, right? That you need information from your rear view mirror and from your speedometer, and that helps you make adjustments as you're driving in real time versus your odometer, which tells you how many miles you've gone. And they're saying that a standardized test is kind of like an odometer that tells you after the fact information that didn't help you as you were driving. So then you'll see like the policy solutions, and these don't line up, you know, super neatly, but you could see where if you were, you know, asked to sit on a panel at your local faith institution or be on the radio, you could say how it's critically important for our nation's future that all students get educated as well as possible. And the education is like a big band, and everybody has a role to play. Teachers and students have a role to play, but voters have to play their role too, and they have to support this equitable school funding formula that we're going to be voting on in November. So you can see how you start with the value, the future is important, really huge idea. You link it to education and bring in your metaphor to get people thinking about, okay, how can this work and what is my role in it? And then you talk about your specific policy solution, how policy can help in order to frame a message that people can be receptive to. So
that's great. Beth, you want to talk through this second slide real briefly, and then so we have time for a little bit of questions before we get end the call.
And so the second is a similar model for the Center for Community Change, and essentially it's a four-step model. It says value, problem, solution, and action. And I'll let you all read there, but it just gives you a sort of framework to talk about. And the Center for Community Change, they were largely promoting the idea of communitarian values that they're going to appeal to. So whereas Framework said, appeal to the future, they say appeal to ideas that we're all in this together, and that we need to appeal to the policies of connection as opposed to policies that drive us apart. So those are the sort of languaging suggestions that they make, as well as the overarching values to which they're encouraging people to appeal. And so I just tried to give a little example there that uses some of their language as well as some of their process to talk about, for instance, community schools, if you were going to talk about that on a radio program, or you were going to talk about that at a town hall meeting.
Excellent. So where does IDEA fit into this, and what can be learned? And I think we'll just kind of wrap that into Q&A. Obviously, I think IDEA is we're both an input into these networks, and we're also a learner in all of them. But be interested in how people respond to this question for themselves, and other questions you have about what you've heard from Beth, Sean, and I, with a little help from Crystal, as we've got a few minutes to make sense of this time together. So I'll stop sharing my screen and show back up as a person in the video, and let's have a conversation for a few more minutes before we close up.
So the presentation is amazing, everyone. So thank you so much for it all. And I guess there's a lot of different. It's exciting to see all these different frameworks to come in different places coming out. And I think I've been familiar with most of them to varying extents, but kind of seeing them all together is really pretty amazing. And I guess where I'm just, as I try and kind of process it together, it's trying to think of what are the, I guess I'm just interested in anything personal. What maybe personal learnings you might have had through, I mean, several of us, Beth, Scott especially, and Sean, you're connected into this, but you've been able to be with multiple different groups now, and kind of conversations in different networks, different places, in different contexts. What maybe is coming up for you as kind of your own kind of maybe personal learning, kind of, obviously it could be any one of these things here, and certainly those last couple of slides are some of the kind of maybe, I think what stands out to me in terms of how to frame and the value set. But I'm just wondering anything else maybe that comes up in terms of other learning kind of personally, in terms of how you even just how you have conversations with people that could be of value on a day-to-day basis. If I'm wanting to talk to my neighbor or my cousin, what's helpful to for talking to them.
Beth, people get to listen to me all the time, so I think, since we have the gift of having you with us, and thank you again for that. What do you think to Dana's question?
So interesting. I feel like that your neighbor. So the sort of learning that's been coming up for me is that, first you got to get past folks institutional barriers, and sometimes these are folks that are our allies necessarily. And so I started to say, you might actually have an easier time talking to your neighbor about these issues, just in a casual conversation, or somebody that you get to meet on the bus, than you might, with somebody who is doing this work in another area and who's kind of closely aligned, because the sort of initial hurdles that we've had to get over is, oh yeah, we know this, we've done this, we've got that. We've already got that taken care of. And so if you just look at our, manifesto, statement, white paper, website, blog, what have you, that encompasses all. And, when you start to probe a little deeper and says, well, maybe not everything is there, and well, have you thought about this, and have you thought about that? And so that sort of opens up the more generative conversations, and that's where we found a lot of fertile ground on the crosswalk. But you have to start by acknowledging people and acknowledging the hard work and the often unsung work that they've done, I think, and then using that as an entree into the conversation, and to bring them in and to start pulling out the learning that they have developed, and wrestling with some of those things. What people think other people think is not necessarily what other people are thinking. I know that sounds like a terrible Yoda quote, but we often end up censoring ourselves because we don't think other people are going to be receptive, or they're not going to understand, or they're not going to figure it out. And so give them a chance, give them the opportunity to really engage into these conversations. And then, it's hard work. It's hard work. Everybody realizes the need for it, but getting folks to engage into it, takes consistent and persistent effort. I guess that would be my third sort of learning there. So, yeah.
Let me add one quick thing, Crystal, and then jump in, is something I've enjoyed talking with Beth about, and people particularly, I think really across several of those groups, is how do you balance kind of discipline or understanding about what effective messaging might be with authenticity? And it doesn't actually come through the presentation, so I think important to lift out. You can not use those words, but send a really authentic message that will resonate with people in a way that finely tuned, crafted, and honed messages without authenticity won't land. And that's a tricky thing to think about as you think about how messages spread and spread across networks and folks, and why I think Beth's point about understanding how folks on the ground doing advocacy work and working with parents and families really matter, because what stands out in those messages is a real raw passion and authenticity. You don't feel like anybody's on a set of talking points and reading to you a generic script. They all hit you. But they're all very different. So how to understand that or think about that in a way of trying to think about how to be strategic in aggregating messages but also not lose the kind of heartbeat or touchstone is just something that I'm interested in and trying to think about. Crystal, what do you got?
No, the only thing I was going to say was I like what Beth said about understanding that we don't always have the answers and can't always assume that other people don't know what they, know what they know or know what they think. And it kind of reminded me of like the citizenship schools that that they had in Johns Island, South Carolina, and in the 60s, which is imperative, especially for communities. It wasn't so much about us teaching you what we think you need to know or learn or what you need to listen to, but it's more so what do you need for your community to be successful and strive. So I appreciate that, Beth. Thank you.
Yeah.
Probably got time for like one more comment or question, and then we're going to have to wrap this up. Beth, you had one more thing? You should give us the parting shot. Again, is we appreciate you being here, so go for it.
Too, yeah, and thank you guys for the opportunity both to dialogue with you and to learn how to use Google Hangouts. So I'm continuing to learn, so this is good stuff. Um, Yeah, just to piggyback off of what you were saying, Crystal, you know, I think you find with people when you get the opportunity to ask them, you know, what's been their most powerful learning experience, right? And I do an exercise where I ask people that, and you know, then we draw some kind of common elements out of them, and they don't say, oh, well, I had a multiple choice assessment at the end. That's what really helped me to learn, you know, that you can work from an inductive process to say, oh, it was personalized. I really, you know, connected with the person who was sharing with me. I was able to pursue my own interest and to relate it to my community. So these elements will come out that people will say, oh, this is how I've learned powerfully in the past, and not necessarily at school. You know, it can be at Scouts or at church or whatever, or from a friend. And you know, when they're able to pull out these elements together and then say, okay, how do we apply this to the schools that we have today? Then it gets them thinking, you know, more in the same vein that progressive transformation agents like the folks on this call are thinking about. And so, you know, it builds off of what they already know. And it says, okay, how do we apply what you know and what you've experienced and what you want for your kids to be powerful in education? How do we apply that to the policy change that we're seeking now? So thanks. It's really great to virtually meet everybody.
Great to meet you as well. Did you have anything else, Scott, before we change this?
You go ahead and close us out, friend. Thank you.
So in about 1 minute, and Beth, you are more than welcome to join us. We're going to shift over into a new link for our open air hangout, where we kind of talk about what's going on, kind of debrief, decompress from you know, the sessions that we've been having so far. I will send out the link and also add it to the event page. Have a great morning. And if you're still interested in following along with what we are going through today, we will continue on with sessions this evening at 5 p.m. Eastern. Beginning with Tools of the Journey, the Idea Hub, Making Sense and Growing Ourselves, and then we will wrap up our week of VIC, Virtual Idea Camp. Have a great morning.